Thank you very much for joining us here as the Words Fest continues. It's great to be back at Words Fest and to have once again the chance to introduce the James Reaney Memorial Lecture. My name is James Reaney, and you'll see I brought along with me, as opposed to last year I had a baseball bat, and this year I have a ball hockey stick. And I'll explain that in a moment. And neither are weapons. They both connect to the speaker, so I'll talk about that. If you were here last year, you may remember seeing me with a baseball bat. That was a tribute to the epic Beckwith and Reaney family baseball games. And our distinguished guest last year, composer John Beckwith, actually had a photograph which was projected there of one of those games. It also helped me believe that I was not just hallucinating or having cases of elaborate memory. The ball hockey stick is a tribute to the the many happy times Tom Smart and I were teammates at places like outdoor at the Central Tennis Courts during the winter, indoor at Tecumseh School, and so forth. And what was the name of the team we often played against? The Meat Packers. We played against really tough fellas, and we had at least one other celebrity from the arts administration world. Who else was playing ball hockey with us then?
He used to work here.
He used to work here. That's one clue. Matthew Teitelbaum, who you may know also was a ball hockey player. I think he was next to ball. He was even better basketball player. But that's the kind of company I was in with Tom and with Matthew. Fantastic. And this would be back, I think, in the 1970s, but certainly into the 1980s. I don't think those games were as epic because the Reaney Beckwith baseball games were frankly fairly rare. We played a lot more, but they were always exhilarating, and we always came away winded but ready for more. The lecture series began in 2010 after the Stratford Public Library and Poetry Stratford reached out to my sister, myself, and Susan Wallace about creating a lecture series to commemorate my late father, James Crerar, Jamie Reaney. Stratford, even though he spent most of his life here in London, Stratford was really his spiritual home, and especially the area in Southeast Hope Township where he was born and grew up on a farm. So it seemed appropriate that we would go up there in the fall for several years in a row to remember Dad. If you do want to know more about James Reaney, or if maybe you know something and want to know more, maybe it's an entirely new name to you, I don't think so, but if so, or about the first speaker in our series, the first lecturer was the late Colleen Thibodeau, and his soulmate and London's greatest poet. And if you want to know more about either Colleen Thibodeau or Jamie Reaney, I think the place I would recommend looking are websites managed by my sister, Susan Reaney, who's here. Susan is here in Vancouver. That's ColleenThibodeau.com and JamesReaney.com. After 6 successful lectures at Stratford, it was clear there was going to be a change. There had been a change at the Stratford Public Library, and they were ready to move in other directions. With our friend Carolyn Doyle of London Public Library. And Carolyn, I'd like to acknowledge you. And you're also part of the stellar Words Festival team, so that gave us a new home for as we moved down to London. London is also a significant part of the Reaney family tradition because my parents lived here starting in 1960, and we spent from 1962 on in one house on 276 Huron Street. The organization and meticulous care going into all those lectures leading up and including this one were by my beloved Susan Wallace. And Susan, if you could just put your hand up and acknowledge all the great things you've done leading to this. And you'd worked with the speakers and the venues and prepared everything in the moments leading up to, and the months leading up to events like this. I'd like to thank Susan for her care and expertise in all the things that we've accomplished so far, and we have an exciting change coming up. This will be the 8th one in the series, and then The next one will be under the banner of the London Public Library. So by the time we get into 2018, there'll be a new team organizing it, and we're very happy to hand off. I was talking to somebody from the London Public Library and said, is that official? And I can say, yes, it is. We are handing off. We're very happy to have completed one phase of the lecture series and to hand off to the London Public Library. Next year's lecture will be the first under the London Public Library banner. And so as we pass the torch, I realize we've reached into 2018, and I haven't really talked much about my friend Tom Smart. Which, well, that's...
I played hockey.
We played hockey, you know that, and he was a heck of a ball hockey player. But he first met my father in 1977 for the dismissal at the drama at the University of Toronto, and that's when Tom and I first met. He's a curator, author, essayist, and director of art galleries. He's written award-winning critical biographies, catalogues, and books on Canadian artists such as Christopher Pratt, Alex Colville, and Mary Pratt. Tom has worked in art galleries and museums such as the Winnipeg Art Gallery, the Frick in Pittsburgh, and the McMichael Canadian Art Collection in Kleinburg. All this and more is apparent on the wonderful Words Fest website, and it leaves me even more in awe of my accomplished friend than before. But what I'd like to zero it down is to specifically London terms about some of Tom's accomplishments. Let me add the following. When it comes to answering the quintessential London question, where did you go to high school? Tom would say CCH and Banting. He has books for sale upstairs, at least they should still be up there, I hope so anyway, on Southwestern Icon's Jack Chambers of Lombardo Avenue, and I sometimes wonder if I should say Lombardo Ave, if that's more London, but London Ave, Lombardo Ave, Jack Chambers of Lombardo Ave, that's more London, and Strathroy's Seth. He began studying and embracing regionalism not too long after the term arose when Greg Curnow was still living downtown, and much later, Tom heard and played with the Nihilist Spasm Band. As we would visit Greg and his noise masters during rehearsal periods, and we would find that while they rehearsed vigorously, they also spent a lot of time talking about their mortgages and roofing. In the 2000s, Tom visited my parents' house on 276 Huron Street, and as we pulled my father's paintings from the boxes where they were stored, he studied them and decided they would be exhibited at the McMichael, where he was executive director. That led to a splendid exhibition at Kleinburg, which then traveled to Museum London. And it now inspires today's memorial lecture, James Reaney's visual art, iconographies of his imagination. So let me, as it's always a joy to do, pass things over to Tom Smart, and I'm glad to announce this as well, the incoming director of Fredericton's Beaverbrook Art Gallery. Tom?
Thank you very much, James. I recall at one of those meatpacker games, and I don't know, maybe it was Matthew Teitelbaum who leaned into me, I saw stars. There was a moment where a shoulder came in, and I never forget it. And so if I start to babble and lose my way, we can blame either the meatpackers, James, or Matthew Teitelbaum. I'm really, really very pleased to be here, and it's even more pleasing to see family and friends here, including a teacher of mine from grade school who's here, Sister Valerie, who apparently took classes with James Reaney. I haven't seen you in a number of years, and thank you very much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a great honor for me to give this lecture on a man who affected me so profoundly early in my life when I was searching for a way to express myself, and I think I started to search when I was probably at St. Joseph's, and to find a deeper significance to the world around me than what reality provided on the surface. When I first met James Reaney, and I'll call him Jamie because that was his name and he wanted to be called Jamie, I was not fully aware of his work as a poet and a dramatist. I was an undergraduate in a very perplexing BFA program at York University, and I was adrift in a curriculum of conceptualism and performance art. One professor who was teaching me a seminar on Italian Renaissance humanism took pity on me after a heartfelt confession when I revealed that I was looking for something much different than creative anarchy. And he suggested I find my way to London to introduce myself to James Reaney. And so I did. I boldly found my way to University College and to Jamie's tower office. His office was up in that great tower halfway up. And I rapped on his door. The man I met was very accommodating and very patient, I might add, as I stated my case. I think he was very busy that day, but he invited me into his office and he immediately showed me a portfolio of his watercolor paintings, some of which I'll discuss later in this lecture. And so my first impression of James Reaney was that he was a visual artist. Soon afterwards, Jamie invited me to join his drama workshop, which was then developing Wakusta. And a year later, I found myself acting and singing in the Dismissal at Harthouse Theatre, and painting scenes such as the backdrop to Wakusta and making a great life in that wonderful NDWT company. It was a magical moment. Looking back, Jamie provided me with a wonderful example of a full, richly imaginative, and disciplined creative life that was released from the incessant march of isms that characterized the mid-1970s visual arts ecosystem. He also exemplified a kind of holistic approach to creativity that embraced many different disciplines all at the same time. In the truest sense, Jamie's creative method was operatic. Even though today's lecture is about the visual arts, it is very difficult to define the distinctions between the visual and the poetic, the dramatic, the symbolic, graphic art making, and writing that constitutes Jamie's creative practice. James Reaney was a complex man and a complex creative artist. The best approach to get at his visual art is to excavate his aesthetic theories and to parse out its separate roots. So today, I'll be talking about the disciplines of iconography, play, Jamie's influences, forms and symbols, the artistic scene in which he worked in London in the 60s and 70s, surrealism, illusion, metaphor, myth, localism, regionalism, the persistence of antiquity in the present day, mysticism, the metaphysical, children's art, and bicameralism. And by laying out this wide-angled context, what Jamie might call a patchwork quilt, I hope to give a sense of who he was as a visual artist and provide some context for understanding his visual art, and perhaps even open up future discussions of his aesthetic. So let's begin with this painting. It is by an unknown artist and likely a copy of a Northern European wintry landscape, painted by someone who evidently had some affection for the scene and what it called up in their memory and imagination. Jamie owned this painting. He bought it as a young man and held on to it his entire life. Even though it looks to be painted by an untutored artist, nevertheless, the picture conveys a lot of information. To my eye, it is composed of episodes. If you look closely at the several elements of the scene, they all exist separately in worlds of their own. The painting is more a collage than anything else. And I want to draw your attention to the specks of paint that represent people in the landscape, and pay attention especially to the fleck, signifying someone, perhaps a young boy, standing alone on the river's ice under the building, right at the center of the composition. Although painted using a very limited gesture, the figure is highly expressive. It is the form of someone standing there looking around, taking in all the elements of the world around them. The composition bears this out. The pieces of the landscape serve as a kind of dialogue boxes describing how this character is finding him or herself in the world. What attracted Jamie to this painting? Well, he never told me, and in fact, I didn't even know he owned it until Susan and James showed it to me after Jamie passed away. But given what I know about his views on art, he was undoubtedly attracted by the honest way the scene is described. Jamie found a kind of purity in the immediate, unfiltered interpretation of a scene or experience, whether or not that experience was on a theater stage, in a poem, in a puppet show, or in visual art. Jamie respected expressions that were unfettered by conventions and forms, all the better to allow the unconscious to be given, to be freely invoked, and the imagination given free rein. He believed in play as the source and engine of creativity. If this painting is about anything, it is about play, skating on a frozen pond, or playing with oil paint to create a magical, innocent, carefree world. Another significant element to Jamie's aesthetic is wrapped up in the term, and this is his term, the iconography of the imagination. So it's a confusing term for me, so let's unpack it and see what we find. A part of Jamie's creativity involved the graphic arts and publishing. He published Alphabet throughout the 1960s as a semi-annual literary journal whose tastes ran the gamut of literary expression and the visual arts. But what drove the magazine was collaging disparate kinds of articles, all the better to foreground allusions from the past art forms, from the visual arts, from literature, from First Nations stories and legends, expressions, from a fathomless well of human experience called myths, and from the unconscious. Jamie's method in Alphabet was to lay bare, quote, the secret alphabet or iconography or language of symbols and myths, all the better to find the fabulous expanse of meaning in artistic forms. Jamie held up William Blake as an exemplar of this aesthetic theory. Blake's poetry was as visual as it was word-based, and his publishing activity held a key, quote, leading to a more powerful inner life. Symbol and metaphor. Jamie found in these two devices ways of illuminating reality in potentially mystical ways. For him, life imitated art, not the other way around. Art makes the chaos of the external world assume an orderly shape. Blake spawned a movement in British art characterized by the heroic metaphysical poet, painter, and graphic artist, which Jamie emulated. In particular, Jamie's approach bears an affinity to the Welsh-British modernist David Jones, who died in 1974, a poet and visual artist who is largely forgotten today, even though during his life he was regarded as one of the most advanced painters and poets of his generation. Jamie can comfortably be compared to Jones and placed in a movement that he is both a part of and one of its leading lights. Jones's great gift as an artist, as was Jamie's, is the manner in which he translates experiences as poetic metaphors. As a painter, Jones took relatively ordinary subjects and imbued them with significance beyond their literalness. In other words, a depiction of a tree or a field, a garden, goats or ponies symbolized something more than what they represented. Jones and Jamie was influenced by a movement in modern literature that sought to retell ancient classical stories in ways that had a contemporary vocabulary. He, Jones, and his literary peers, among them T.S. Eliot, retrieved myths and legends from antiquity, Greek and Roman mythology, and translated them into language and forms of the mid-20th century. The purpose of this movement was to find enduring symbols that told profound truths about humanity. In other words, the iconography of the imagination was Jones and his peers' subject. Jones mined this creative vein to great effect by plumbing his imagination and unconscious, and by describing what he discovered deep in his being, gave him artistic forms, visual art, and poetry that resonated widely in a society at large, and I want to say a society that was torn apart by World War I and the effects of that. This impulse is evident in Jamie's 1978 watercolor that reflects his interest not only in interpreting a specific place, an East Zora Bridge and cow, but also imbuing the subject with a mystical, almost dazzling truth, and expressing it in a way that compresses the real, the mystical, and the metaphysical. Here is Jones's 1936 self-portrait. Compare it with this slide. One of Jamie's paintings from 1992, The Poet's Table, that embodies the sense of an automatically painted portrait, a surrealist process that allows for the pure expression of the unconscious, free from convention and manner. It also is a kind of summative image that points to the poet's other expressive modes in the cards on the table. A symbolic emblem, a praying man, a child's drawing, a nude, and a reference to a student newspaper. As visual artists and poets, Jones and Reaney were attuned to the possibility, the probability of instant transformation. They were open to the miracle that an event or a scene could turn into something else right before their eyes. They were inspired by metaphysical poets who used words to explode the mind in ways that allowed us to witness universal truths in particular moments. In Jamie's self-portrait, the poet has laid out in his hand of cards a kind of iconography of his expressiveness in a manner that echoes a movement populated by artists such as Jones and ultimately by Blake. In the Jones self-portrait, for example, a similar purpose is expressed as delicate watercolor washes, where Jamie has used these various signs. Jamie's use of the word iconography resonated in the early 1960s academic world in ways that it may not today. Iconography comes from the art historical discipline of iconology that was developed by Erwin Panofsky, shown here, in the mid-20th century. Panofsky was a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton at the same time that Einstein was there at the same school. Iconography has a very specific definition. As an intellectual discipline, its purpose is to illuminate meaning in the visual arts in three specific ways: by describing a visual representation's formal elements, by sketching in the contextual clues that illuminate a work of art's meaning, and third, by describing an object's symbolic meaning based on clues that are cast up in the first two categories, and by placing the art in a historical context. Panofsky's iconology was and remains a very important and influential method to decode meaning in the visual arts. It was the theoretical basis that determined the way art history was taught in the post-war years right up through the 1980s. Panofsky and his peers, such as A.B. Warburg, who founded the Warburg Institute, were much more interested in cataloging recurring types across centuries of art making. Their purpose was to trace the persistence of mythic structures in the visual arts, and how antiquity is reflected in new contemporary forms across the centuries on down to the present. So iconography is a very specific discipline that allows form ultimately to be set aside to retrieve myths and legends from antiquity, and to translate them in a language and forms of the present day. Jamie's use of the term iconography of the imagination riffs off Panofsky's method by folding in a deep respect for the capacity of the free imagination to cast up mythic forms embedded in the unconscious and imagined as art. Jamie's iconographical approach allows for allusion, symbol, and metaphor to have great significance in the structure of a work of art's meaning. Here are some slides that illustrate a Panofskyan sequencing of the iconography of a lamb, first as an ancient Roman form, then reflecting an Old Testament meaning, and then a Christian symbol of Jesus, and the lamb's symbolic meaning transforms based on contextual clues. For Jamie, wait for it. For Jamie, symbols and the persistence of antiquity were very fertile lenses through which to see reality transformed before the eyes through the potency and the magic of metaphor. And for Jamie, the most profound transformation was that which occurred in his beloved Southwestall. Jamie was fascinated by expression in all its forms, from richly elusive verse, from recondite 16th century engravings, to folk art. And among the folk art that affected him a great deal, to the extent that it even appeared as a reference in a play, in his play, Colors in the Dark, is the work of the fictional Mr. Winemayor, a character based on the real-life George Laithwaite, who died in 1956. He was a farmer and a sculptor who populated his farmyard, Laithwaite Apple Park Farm, with concrete figurative sculptures of historical and biblical subjects. Jamie's fascination with Laithwaite's art, hard to say, no doubt first extended from the sheer audacity and the ambition of his creative project, not to mention their unique, eccentric qualities. They appear fully formed in a sculpture garden, and they play well together. As works of visual art, Jamie the iconographer would have been drawn to them for the manner in which they translated art historical and biblical, and literary antecedents in a wholly unique and place-specific way. What, after all, is a more natural media in Godrich than concrete? On the screen is a 1942 sculpture, Balaam the Mighty Monarch, that blends the biblical story with a reference to Adolf Hitler. It also retrieves similar iconography from the ancient past. There are many, many examples, but here's one from Antiquity of Dionysus on a mule. And a Laithwaite sculpture of two stags fighting, which I'm comparing to this mosaic. And one more, an ancient relief of Gilgamesh, and this Laithwaite piece of a cowherd. This iconographic methodology informed Jamie not only as a poet and as a graphic artist, but also as a visual artist. He thought and created as an iconographer who believed that the font of all icons is the imagination, the unconscious that houses it, and the genetic memories that the complex brain might well have locked away somewhere in its neurons and in its synapses. Jamie did not work in a vacuum either. For students here of the cultural history of London, he arrived in this city at a pivotal and magical moment in its cultural growth, and indeed in the development of a national culture. It was a time when many young academics, such as Jamie, and artists were looking to create a cultural nexus in London for the simple reason that they needed to survive creatively and intellectually. Jamie was an integral figure in the 1960s scene here in London, one that saw a great deal of cross-pollination in the arts, particularly between poetry and painting. Greg Curnow, Bernice Vincent, Jack Chambers, Colleen Thibodeau, Marion Woodman, Michael Ondaatje, Alice Munro, among many others, carved out institutions and creative identities that sustained them locally. However, the unintended and very positive consequence is that through their creative art, they helped to redefine art in Canada and to elevate it on an international stage. Jamie was part of a small group within this community of London artists, which was deeply influenced by surrealism and data, chance and randomness, and the knowledge that what was right before your eyes had either potentially mystical significance or, according to the nihilists, no significance at all. This activity was one element of a larger movement called regionalism that was meant to assert the importance of Canadian cultural expressions in all their forms in the very real face of a perceived threat from American imperialism. Jamie Curnow, along with a band of nihilists, including a couple of ball hockey players, blew open the cultural landscape by privileging the idea that unconventional expression, pure psychic automatism, automatic writing, and what have you, and unstructured noise were all potent means of exploding consciousness and liberating the imagination. Jamie's iconographical methodology found a close cousin in the surrealist approach that fueled Curnow, Tony Urquhart, and the nihilist Spasm Band, an irreverent noise band whose anti-establishmentism was a coded way of redefining the surrealist technique of the exquisite corpse in musical terms, finding the shape and structure of a group's identity via unstructured corporate creativity. This slide shows Jamie with Curnow and Chambers and a Toronto painter called William Ronald during an interview at a local hotel. This is a screen take from The Umbrella Show. Jamie was absorbed into the vibrant cultural scene here in London. He contributed to its development by working with Curnow, Chambers, and Urquhart, whose own creative sensibilities echoed his own. Chambers also valorized Southwestern folk art and folk expressions. He included what might seem to be random flotsam of daily life in a way that reflected an Arte Povera sensibility or Joseph Beuys conceptualism. Bus transfers, broken hockey sticks, all visual expressions of a regional character, and bicycles found their way into his art. Curnow did not imbue his found objects with mystical potentialities. They reflected, rather, the influence of Alain Robbe-Grier's Nouveau Roman movement, objectively described reality without any subjectivity added to description. Jamie, on the other hand, was drawn to randomness and chance as artistic strategies because he saw that they could reveal hidden significance and potentially transform reality. Jamie found a close cousin in Jack Chambers, who returned to London at about the same time that Jamie arrived from Winnipeg, and in Tony Urquhart, who was the artist and curator at Western's Mackintosh Gallery. Chambers' rigorous artistic training in Spain provided him with the sensibility to see and to depict sacred subjects in everyday places, to invoke the ancestors in a landscape, and to imagine a world where reality can be interpreted as art to reveal transcendent perceptions. This is Jack Chambers' glorious painting called McGillivray County. And this is Tony Urquhart's, one of Tony Urquhart's Revenant paintings, exemplifying a form of visual poetry that is elusive and mystical, and which conjures up the ancestors as voices and presences that alter perceptions. This is another beautiful example of his Revenant paintings. Jamie moved easily amongst these different artistic sensibilities. He fed off them in his own work, and the visual artists benefited from his poetic pictorialism. Jamie published this book, an exquisite collaboration with Chambers, in The Dance of Death at London, Ontario. The visual also was an integral part of his poetry practice, as we can see here in his emblem poems. And Thomas Jerry, who is here in the audience, gave an excellent lecture about his emblem poems in an earlier Reaney lecture. He spoke about their references and the antecedents and their very dense and esoteric meanings. Jamie also found in the diagram, or the doodle, a portal to a rich and personal discourse on symbolism. His 1965 article, Search for an Undiscovered Alphabet, is an important expression of the symbolic nomenclature of simple diagrams that serve to inform his emblems. It is based on a kind of imagistic structural reading he applies to some metaphysical poems, modernist literature, and also to contemporary advertising, pictographs, hieroglyphs, ideograms, and Kabbalistic marks, signifying a symbolic representation to the eye. The article is remarkable not only for the agility of Jamie's knowledge of literature, but also for his keenly imaginative application of visual diagrams as expressions, as emblems of literary structure. Jamie proved that alphabets are, above all else, visual, symbolic diagrams that release ideas from the mind and the imagination. What, he asks, if there is another form of alphabet, an expanded lexicon of signs and symbols that tell pivotal stories while unlocking ever deeper levels of meaning? This investigation is central to reading Jamie's visual arts, and also in reading his literary works. Foundational to his creative project are these alphabets, which give structure to his narratives, define his staging of plays and movements of actors, and how images are set on paper or graphic motifs and are applied to pages of poetry, and even how geese organize themselves in a gaggle. For Jamie, the pre-fallen world of childhood represented a form of paradise. The expressions of children constituted a form of pure communication that we can either lose as we grow older or retain. He was intensely interested in how children expressed themselves in words and also visually. This interest drew him to the work of Rhoda Kellogg, seen here on the slide, a pioneering researcher of the mental development of children that comes out of their artwork. Her research charts ways in which children make diagrams from the age of 2 through their childhood years. Kellogg refused to regard a child's scribbles as meaningless, as mere traces of muscular activity. She tracked the path that is taken to render a scribble a symbol, and a symbol a conscious representation of perceived objects. Kellogg came to the conclusion that this path is deeply etched in the human unconscious, and it rarely varies until the time it becomes a personal mode of education, or representation, These stages of development are expressed in this mandala, representing Kellogg's rigorous analysis of children's drawings, their development, and the ubiquity of the mandala form that is adopted by children as meaningful signs. This slide shows a taxonomy of particular symbols that characterize the development of pre-adult art. Jamie found a powerful artistic theory in Kellogg's work, perhaps even more so than he did in Panofsky's. Along with Panofsky and iconography, metaphysical poetry, surrealism's chance and randomness strategies, symbolic form, Kellogg gave Jamie a visual nomenclature that unlocked his creativity. It also gave him a language to blend abstraction and pictographic signs on a single page. This is from his volume of poems, The Red Heart. And to render actual things, typewriter keys, in a painting that conveys several elusive meanings simultaneously, about how non-referent signs can be metaphors of imaginative expression, and how color can reinforce these messages as autonomous visual emblems. Here's Jamie on the right, standing right up against the border there, with fellow winners of the 1962 Governor General's Award. And that's Marshall McLuhan, likely reading in a very loud voice from his book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, which won in the nonfiction category that year. Reaney and McLuhan knew each other well before the picture was taken. Colleen had been his graduate student, and the families visited each other often. But the relationship between the two men goes much deeper. Jamie seems to have been taken with McLuhan's ideas. No doubt McLuhan's theories about typography affected the way Jamie worked as a graphic artist and as a typographer on Alphabet. On practically every page of Alphabet, you can see him experimenting with the very medium of typography and how it can convey meaning pictorially in and of itself. But Jamie's visual art was also influenced by McLuhan's ideas of bicameralism, the two hemispheres of the brain, and about paradoxical relationships that contribute to new knowledge. Medium and message, written and oral, foreground and background, visual and acoustic, hot and cool, figure and ground. These all demark the fields McLuhan traveled through as an academic. His theories on media extend from a view of the mind as having two distinct hemispheres, each defined by different ways of thinking. The left hemisphere of the brain controls logic, systems, and sequences. The right is the custodian of the spatial and the way of thinking creatively. When research began exploring the bicameral structure of the brain around the early part of the 1970s, McLuhan looked on, likely ruefully, pronouncing that he had anticipated these outcomes, of course, in his work since the 1940s. Bicameralism was an important part of Jamie's visual aesthetic. As you see in this slide, he collaged his drawings, family photographs, poster images, and formats that were published under his pseudonym, James Reaney. Reaney made his first appearance in Gambit, a late 1950s and early 1960s satirical broadsheet published by Clarington-based illustrator and contrarian John Richmond. Gambit had a Dickensian air about it in the way it lobbed softball critiques at current events, ideas, and artist egos on its pages, and how it masked its true authors, in pseudonyms. From time to time, Reaney contributed to the broadsheet, and in subsequent publications, including the examples that you'll see on the screen in front of you. These McLuhan-influenced pages show how Jamie and Reaney explored the very medium of print, photo reproduction, and collage to create interesting and puzzling visual arts that could be called visual poems. What I find most interesting is that in this format, Jamie seems to have felt free to show off his skills in drawing, which dance among the images, fit snugly into the composition, and are turned into old master works of art right before our eyes. Here are just a few of the pages. These slides of collaged reproductions are interesting in the way that they combine old family photos and group shots, one of a classroom of primary school students. These combined collages are sophisticated responses to the Revenant and Ancestor paintings by Urquhart and Chambers that we saw earlier, but they are clothed in Jamie's unique anagogic style. Bicameralism in McLuhan opened up a fertile vein for Jamie to explore as a visual artist. His artist peers in London provided models that he emulated in his own manner. And by the way, the photo of the school children was a photo of Jamie's class. It looks like it was around grade 3 or 4 in Southeast Hope, and that's Jamie, third from the left, back row. Looks really tough. Above all else, Jamie's art reflects his deep love of place, Southwestern, and its history in all of its dimensions. In wanting to know the world he inhabited and its distinctiveness, its regional unique characteristics, Jamie painted landscapes. In particular, he made it a project to travel to every one of Southwestern Ontario's townships and interpret them in watercolors, some of which you see in these slides. He found in the many variations on the built form of the barn a resonant metaphor of place, of its history and people, and of the manner in which internationalism was expressed in vernacular forms. His watercolors also show an intense immediacy. By painting them, Jamie occupied the subjects, made himself both a documentarian and a witness to the subterranean veins of landscape and memory. His purpose in taking the particular and plumbing its layers was to expose mythic forms that declared their presences visibly through the built forms. He transformed place into metaphors of presence. So let's go back to that painting we saw at the beginning of this lecture, and that speck of a form watching people play. If Jamie had a pictorial avatar, it is that figure. Jamie's visual art is complex. His iconography is many-layered, striated, convergent, and divergent. As I have shown, his art has a metaphysical side, a place specificity. It comes from and was fertilized by an explosive creative milieu in London, and of a tradition of metaphysical poet-painters. It is associated with the discipline of iconology and bicameralism. It is influenced by the research into children's art, and it constantly strove to express the ubiquity of myth in everyday life. Life for Jamie imitated art. The essence of Jamie's visual art is his resounding respect for play as a catalyst to unlock creativity, his and ours, and to transform the world perceptually through metaphors that resonate mythically. The device of the playful witness is a compelling trope in Jamie's art, all of it. But in his visual art, it is represented in different forms, through the iconography of the resplendent figure. The boy in the sun, the boy who lived in the sun, is an image I'll leave you with. In his visual art, and in all of his art, all of his iconography, Jamie returned frequently to this dazzling iconographical device, which is a metaphor of his place as an artist before creation, his creation, and our creation. Thank you.
That was fabulous. I'd like to once again thank Tom. And I think we have in the house, we have quality here. Everyone, it's a fantastic crowd. Applaud yourselves, etc. But I think we have people, several of Marion Johnson, who was at the 2011. Marion, you're here, I think? Tom Gary, who came down from Barrie, I think is here. Tom, fantastic. And Jean Mackay, who is here as well. And have I missed any of the other people? So I think we have 4 of the 8 people who've given lectures. Fantastic. Tom, that was tremendous. Just selfishly, I find in all 8 of these, including my mom's, I learned so much about my parents and about my father's art and my mom's art that I didn't know. And this was especially, there were images in there I did not know about, and have certainly enriched my understanding of what's gone on. Are there any questions? Are there anyone? I have a question. Who was that with Dad with the really long hair and he had sort of...
I thought it was you, wasn't it?
It is. No, that was me. That's at the York Hotel. And it's very telling. I think that was the only time Dad said of the Spasm Band, he said, "Oh, they're oriental and restful." And so I don't think that quite jibes with the fingers in the ears we see there. But no, that must be sometime from, I'm guessing, the 1970s, from the amount of hair and the sideburns I had. I'd like to ask something about if I could start off with the pages where there is a combination of archived family photographs, drawings, and text. Was it the magazine that was putting those together, or do you think, or was it? I don't know that stuff at all.
I was looking at it, and I don't know exactly the publication. It's one of those things I picked up along the way, and realized that it comes out of Gambit. It's not Gambit, but Gambit was this kind of crazy thing that John Richmond would do.
Sure, I should let you.
It looked like that, is what I'm trying to say. It's there's a complete set of Gambit that's at the University of Toronto Fisher Rare Book Library. Very hard to photograph in there. But those pages show the kind of pseudonymous or pseudonym that Jamie hid behind to create these really amazing collages where there's so much going on, these drawings. If you got letters from Jamie, often he would draw that kind of a figure into the letter, or he would collage things together. I remember when I was rehearsing for the dismissal, and Jamie was sitting in the corner, and I wasn't on. I was waiting while a scene rehearsed. I went over to Jamie. He was drawing. He was drawing figures. These figures that you saw, say, in that the Poet's Table. And he was just almost in a trance, just calling this up, and it had nothing to do with any of the reality that was occurring in front of him, but it had everything to do with the reality that was occurring inside of him. And these, we'll call them doodles or collages, I think were incredibly expressive because he believed in this kind of surrealist approach of unconscious drawing, just letting it come out in a way that's unfettered and see what comes out, and find that meaningful as a process, and then maybe parse some of the images that would come together in a way that seemed right at the time and spontaneous, but were in effect ordered by a different set of rules. Surrealism.
Mary?
I just want to say that I feel you really opened my eyes to Jamie as an artist, because it's never been my primary interest in Jamie, but I'm just thinking, well, there's so much more here. And I wonder if you can comment further on the connection between these art techniques you're talking about and the plays, and his output as a playwright.
Well, as a playwright, he believed effectively in making lists first and reciting lists and starting with scribbles. He once told me that to read Rhoda-Kellogg, because that's the way I direct my plays, or that's the way I organize my plays. I still don't know what all of that means, but he would point to some of those doodles and the way the scribbles are made in Rhoda-Kellogg's research. There are very specific times when these types of diagrams occur and how they figure out onto a page. And he says, that's how I organize stage direction and have actors move around the stage. And that made sense to me when I was acting in his plays, because he would look that way. He was very gestural, and he said, go like this or go like that or use this quadrant. And he was almost drawing with the actors. And so, as I said at the beginning, it's very hard to say, well, he's a visual artist here. This is his visual art. Here's his poetry, and here's his playwriting, and here's all of his. It's this larger kind of a movement that I found very attractive. It's not the march of isms, but it's this sensibility that is emulated, that he was trying to, I think he saw in say, Jones, or that type of a movement in these modern metaphysicals, that allowed for a process of discovery with words, with images, with paint, and all of it coming together in the proper art form that was appropriate to the intention, if that makes any sense at all. It was a very rainy kind of exploration, but I think I've come to the place, and I hope I've answered your question.
And you mentioned his interest in opera.
Well, I called him operatic because what are you going to? What is this? There's music, there's a librettist, there's recitation, there's movement, there's color, well, that's an opera. And he wrote libretti for operas. In fact, I think he wrote an opera. But he thought in terms of opera. He would hear a story and said, well, that would make a great novel. No, it would be a better opera. And he was right, that Canadians don't have this kind of great operatic traditions that, say, you have in Italy, even in America. And our musical plays might aspire to opera, but they aren't. There isn't the grand kind of mythic cadence that you would find, say, in a traditional opera, a crazy little story that tells something absolutely fundamental about the human condition at a particular time. I always thought of him as operatic, and in all good opera, you can't say, well, here's the visual, we'll take that out, and here's the musical, and here's dance, and here's acting. It's all part of a piece, holistic art creation. That was, for me, very attractive because it wasn't, pure formalism or post-painterly abstraction followed by performance art, followed by this and that, which was just so antithetical to what I thought of as a creative process and creative expression.
First, Gene, then Stephen.
I'm curious about where all this stuff is. I mean, I know I recognize some of it, and I know like the boy and the sun is on the blog or the website, so. But for instance, the ones about the townships and the barns, I mean, where are those located?
Where are those located? Those were pictures that were taken when they were on view at the McMichael. And Chris Finn, who was the curator of that exhibition, visited the family, and the family gave him access to that. So I think they're still in the family, or may have been passed over to the archives at Western. Not sure.
A lot of them are. We think a lot of them are in the Museum London collection. I think we donated some of them here. Some of them are still in private collections, obviously, but I think we hope they're. We hope through our meticulous record keeping they've gone this way. That was one of the things. Some of them are in the Macintosh collection as well.
Because something like this then becomes invaluable because there you can get your hands on it. I felt that way with John Morgan
Yes.
last time, that he had all those tapes of the operas.
Yeah.
That, I mean, some of us might like to see those again.
Yeah.
How do you get a hold of them?
Is there some way to maybe move this to the? I don't want to jump in, but Susan, is this something that might work on the website in some way, depending on what you and Tom can?
Hopefully there's a retrospective exhibition that comes up and you can see them in an art gallery.
Yeah.
That would be nice.
I'll jump in just before we take more. It meant a great deal late in my father's life that Tom showed this interest, because the last phase of Dad's life, creatively, Gene helped him with the book, the Donnelly's book, and really, that wouldn't have happened without Gene, but he was still painting, and I think it meant, it was, I guess validation is a weak word, but it was something like that Tom was interested in and championed these works, and that was really from the 1990s, although many of the paintings were older, but that was something he was still working towards late in his life.
Well, what I'd hoped to do was something I'd done at the Frick. You develop a program of poet painters. We had Charles Pachter with Margaret Atwood. We had, I think, Christopher and Mary Pratt, and Christopher wrote poetry. And the tradition of the poet painter is long. There's a long tradition that goes back centuries. But in Canada, we have a great poet painter in Jamie. And what's the relationship between the two? How does one inform the other, and the other inform the other? So I wanted to see what that looked like, and so I devoted a little gallery at the back to exploring the idea of poet painters, and to see if that might open up the discussion, so we could stop talking about the group of seven at the McMichael long enough to realize that there might be something else going on in Canadian art. 4 years. I lasted 4 years.
Stephen, I think you had a question?
I was just going to ask about those concrete sculptures. They seem to resonate in an interesting way today, and how Jamie got associated or would have been influenced by them, and where, to follow up on Jean, like, where are they now?
Godrich.
Yep. I called them cement sculptures, which Dad called them in Colors in the Dark, and someone instantly, before the Free Press even got to print, but it was online, said, "This is the stupid mistake people always make. It's not, anyway, but the Lathwaite sculptures, if you're driving to Godrich on Highway 8, which is a great drive anyway, you're getting close, Ben Miller's over here, and the sculptures will be there. One of them was taken out by a drunk driver, and has been repaired following a $13,000 insurance settlement, but here, I'll put a plug in. This is time. My impression was that the Lathwaite descendant was in his 80s and was like a lot of great Canadians who have great things getting near the end of his tether, and how do I preserve this? How do I enhance it? Who's going to take it over? And that stuff is amazing. I mean, the ones we saw are spectacular, but that's, as far as I know, we were there last summer. And they're very approachable. They'll sell you apple butter too if you pull over. So it's well worth your time.
There was quite an interest in the 1960s. Greg Curnow and Pierre Théberge, who was then a curator at the National Gallery of Canada and later became the director, they formed a society for the preservation of Canadian and Acronym. Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Judith. It's and where has that gone now? Because of we're going to lose this vernacular form of this folk art that is so meaningful and kept people sane, and it really brought some color and life to this part of the world and made us distinctive.
Jamie, how did your parents, two creative people, influence each other's creativity?
Maybe I'll let Susan, as keeper of the websites, you maybe have a better handle on that than I do.
Influence, I think, just that it's important. You don't have to be a professor of literature and a busy job at the university to, make a painting. You could just be at home and it's your own expression.
But how did they influence each other? Did they influence each other?
They had a lot of influence on each other. They met at university where they both studied literature.
And there were examples too of my parents. One of the frankly the best things the Free Press ever did was publish my parents' extended poem about Dieppe, which they both had experienced being from afar during World War II. But that was a spectacular accomplishment, and they would occasionally directly collaborate in readings and things like that. So,
An interesting topic for another Reaney lecture.
Well, Boom. Good. Any other questions? And I think, no, I don't want to speak for the Words Festival, but are the books still for sale? Is there, this is where the, is anything, I hope so anyway, because this is where.
Everything's closed up upstairs.
Everything's closed up upstairs. This is where Jeff Healy would normally have said, I can almost see the merch tent from here. But,
I guess I'm walking home tonight.
well, but Tom, I think there are books, your books are available through.
Through Porcupine's Quill and online through the usual channels.
I'd like to please join me in congratulating Tom on his new job with his